Good evening. I'm Gavin Cleespies. I'm the Director of Programs, Exhibitions, and Community Partnerships for the Massachusetts Historical Society. I'm happy to welcome those of you who are joining us in person, as well as the people who are joining us online. For anyone who might be visiting MHS for the first time, MHS is the first historical society in America. We date back to 1791. And since the 1790s, we've been making material available to researchers and the public. We have an amazing library with a collection of over 14 million manuscript pages. This includes the papers of 3 of the first 6 US presidents. We also have the papers of physicians, politicians, poets, and protesters. And all of this is available to anyone who wants to use it free of charge. We also host a wide variety of programs. We're only able to host programs like this evening, thanks to the support of our members and donors. We hope that you'll return for future programs, and we also hope that you'll consider becoming a member or supporting MHS. This evening, we're happy to continue our partnership with the History Project with our program, Politics and Pride, from LGBTQ marriage to trans rights. This program looks at how the fight for LGBTQ plus rights in the political sphere has led to the current moment. Panelists will examine what issues were deemed most important over the years, how activist priorities have evolved in the present, how the success and failures of past movements in Massachusetts informed campaigns today. Arline Isaacson, Carmel Valentine, and Tanya Neslusan will highlight their current work at the Mass GLBTQ Political Caucus, Mass Transgender Political Coalition, and Mass Equality, and discuss issues that are still being fought, from affordable housing to healthcare to trans rights. Each of our speakers will give a brief overview, starting with Arline, who will briefly recount the history of the movement, followed by Tanya and Treyandre. And then we'll have a moderated conversation, followed by an open conversation for our guests, both in person and online. So to tell you very briefly about our guests this evening, Arline Isaacson led lobbying for America's first same-sex marriage breakthrough in Massachusetts and was named to Boston Magazine's 50 Most Powerful list. She was Director of Governmental Affairs for the City of Boston, President for what's now the Massachusetts Budget and Policy Center, lobbied for the Mass Teachers Association, and worked with Phelps Stokes to launch their African Ethical Leadership Institute. Treyandre Carmel Valentine, who is an immigrant of mixed ancestry from the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. They have been advocating for trans rights for over 15 years and have over 10 years of experience supporting LGBTQ plus survivors of domestic violence and working for LGBTQ plus inclusion through an anti-oppression framework. Treyandre currently serves on the Boston Human Rights Commission. Tanya Neslusan is an LGBTQ activist, currently serving as the Executive Director of Mass Equality, a statewide LGBTQ advocacy organization. She also currently serves as co-chair of the Bay State Stonewall Democrats, as the Affirmative Action and Outreach Officer of the Sturbridge Democratic Town Committee, and as one of the co-chairs of the LGBTQ Outreach Subcommittee of the Massachusetts Democratic State Committee. She is also a member of the Emerge Massachusetts Alumni Committee. And I have to say that we had planned to have Joan Ilaqua from the History Project acting as moderator for this panel. Unfortunately, Joan is under the weather, so I will be pinch hitting for her. So without further ado, I'll turn it over.
Stand or sit?
You can sit, or you can stand if you'd like to.
Which one makes me look younger? Okay. That's easy. Hello, everyone. Good evening. Maya Angelou said that you can't really know where you're going unless you know where you've been. So I volunteered to give not a history of the movement. That's a little bit more than I think could take any one evening, but rather just a quick overview of the last 30-ish plus years of legislative work in our state on LGBTQ issues, because I think it's important. It's interesting to understand the trajectory of what happened with our people, how it moved from, my view of it, individual rights to relationship rights to now, I generically call it the challenges of our people, which I can explain if time allows. So here's the way I would describe it. Individual rights. The first things we fought for were to allow us to be human beings, to exist. And that include, please don't kill us, please don't beat us up, and please don't jail us, in sequential order. And in dealing with the please don't beat us up, we eventually ended up with hate crimes legislation on the laws in Massachusetts. And the don't jail us were some court cases, but I'm going to focus on the legislature. In the 70s, our community decided to fight for anti-discrimination legislation. There existed in Massachusetts a law that said you cannot discriminate against people in employment, housing, credit, and public accommodations based on their race, their gender, their race, their creed, their color, ethnicity, etc. And to that list, we wanted to add the phrase or sexual orientation. And I say we writ large because I wasn't around in the 70s, thank you very much, to do that work. We called it the Gay and Lesbian Civil Rights Bill. Eventually, at first they called it the Gay Rights Bill. It took 17 years to add those two words to the existing body of law, which is sort of amazing. And I say that because it gives context to what we're doing now, what we have done, and what we're going to be doing next. In the middle of that, we had to fight the AIDS crisis came up. And with the AIDS crisis came a new level of discrimination, because suddenly then there were people who wanted to discriminate against our people because they thought we were going to infect the entire world. There were even bills filed to quarantine us all on an island in Boston Harbor, which might have been quite nice, but it wasn't meant in a nice way. And we ended up passing a law that said they could not force you to take HTLV3, which is what they used to call HIV testing, and they couldn't force you to let that information be anything but confidential without your written informed consent. Once we won those individual rights, we then moved on to relationship rights, which was really push what I call the ick factor for a lot of straight folks who were not comfortable with us. And that was like, yeah, you're okay being a person, but ick, when you start thinking about relationships, it's start thinking about the things they didn't really want to think about. So that included sex at the top of the list. And so we had to ask them, may we please have it not be illegal for us to have sex? And some of that was handled at the SJC in Massachusetts, and some was handled at the Supreme Court. And ultimately they decided that, yes, we're allowed to have adult, consensual, non-commercial, intimate relations. Some of it involved our right to be parents, parental rights. Some of you may not remember or know that in the 80s, there was a very nasty fight that took place in Massachusetts. And then from Massachusetts spread across the country. It was fight over whether or not gays and lesbians, but it was really LGBTQ. We didn't have all the letters in there back then, could be parents, could be foster parents. And if time allows, and if someone asks later, I would love to tell you the dirt on what really happened back then, because it's an amazing story and a disgraceful story, and one that ought to be known and be on the record, because it involves the media as well as legislative action. But for the moment, for these introductory remarks, I'll just simply say that there were year after year after year attempts to ban us from being foster parents or adoptive parents, and in some cases, even biological parents. Don't ask how. They could never have pulled it off, which is kind of why I thought it would have been fun to pass it, because then I'd like to see them try and enforce a law against us becoming biological parents. But that was the more mischievous part of my personality. Eventually, we moved into the relationship issue that most people know about, the fight for marriage, the fight for legal recognition of our relationships. It didn't start with marriage. It started with what was then called domestic partner benefits. And Lord knows we couldn't fight for full-blown domestic partner benefits. That was a bridge too far. We could fight for something small and incremental. So we went for health insurance benefits, because we could frame it as equal pay for equal work. We'd say two secretaries working in the same office, each doing the same thing. The straight one just got married at age 17, and the gay one has been in a relationship for 30 years. Why can't he support his partner with health insurance when this brand new employee with a brand new relationship can provide health insurance? So we had to frame it in terms that created comfort levels for legislators back then before we could move on from there. Eventually, we did move on But even then, when we started to move on and say more expansive domestic partner benefits, we tended to focus on the things that were most poignant as opposed to necessarily the most fair, the most comprehensive list. And so, for example, we would focus on things like the ability to make medical decisions for our loved ones or burial decisions for our loved ones. That was it was done intentionally. I confess that I used to jokingly call it that we would fight for dead and dying homo benefits, because as long as we were dead or dying, they could imagine giving us some parceling out some benefits, some rights from legal protections for us. It was too much to give us full, broad legal protection. But there were horrible instances back then that we all knew in our community, that we'd all heard of. The story about a lesbian couple from the Midwest, they get into a car accident. One woman is significantly injured, and the accident victim's parents sweep in, take her back home to some place where she never wanted to live, and they never wanted to accept her, and they never approved of her life, and threw her into a nursing home. Her partner said, I want to be there for her. I want to be there to help visit all the time and help her exercise her and do things to help her recover. But she wasn't allowed because she did not have a legal relationship to the accident victim. It was a story we heard again and again and again, and it scared the hell out of all of us and forced us to think in terms about security and legal relationships in a way we hadn't previously. At the same time, we also, all of us, heard stories from friends and family about other really emotionally painful things. One of the lobbyists for our organization, a guy named Bill Connolly, his first partner passed away. The partner's family swept in, grabbed the body, made the funeral plans, didn't consult with Bill, and they did not allow him to be there. Thankfully, the owner of the funeral home knew that Bill and his partner were in a relationship. He snuck Bill in the back room so he could say his final farewell. Excuse me. You know, I'm a tough cookie in all sorts of ways, but I'm a wimp in others. So I apologize. But stories like that get to me still, years and years and years and years later. But that was standard for our community back then, standard pain for our community back then. I'll share one nugget of a little known history of what happened when we were trying for domestic partner benefits writ large, more comprehensive than just dead and dying homo benefits. And the state of Vermont, you may know or recall, passed something when we asked them to recognize our marriages, they said no, but we'll create this new thing called civil unions. So in between the time civil unions passed in Vermont and we in Massachusetts were fighting for marriage, an interesting negotiation was taking place. The then Speaker of the House, Tom Finneran, a guy I know and like, but he's a conservative man and he did not support our marriage rights. Tom Finneran and his leadership team were concerned that we might just win the right to marry at the Supreme Judicial Court in Massachusetts. And in the panic of that possibility, they threw together a little group and they said, go negotiate with the gays and see if you can get them to agree to something short of marriage so that we don't have to accept, God forbid, marriage equality, although it wasn't called marriage equality back then. So one of the two most conservative anti-marriage equality legislators led the committee, led this special task force, and Finneran and his folks selected who from our community would be in the room, which is always a sign that there's something amiss. But we did have good people in those meetings. And I tell you the story simply to say that the negotiations, they wanted to offer us something like civil unions, but it wasn't civil unions, really. You know, marriage gave us 1,400 benefits, rights, and protections. Civil unions gave us a lot, but not nearly 1,400. They wanted to give us civil unions light with a T, and that was way down here. It was about 25% of the benefits, rights, and legal protections that we deserved and would have had under marriage. So it was sort of like negotiating with someone in a flea market, I want 1,500. No, we'll give you 25%. We struggled mightily about the question of, should we accept the deal? Now, on the one hand, we knew that there was a court case going on, and we wanted to see if the court case would win, and we might win the case at the SJC. But on the other hand, to say no to the deal meant we were saying no to our people who needed some of those rights, benefits, and protections immediately, to people who immediately needed health insurance protection for their partners, to people who immediately needed to be able to make medical decisions for their partners, to people who immediately needed the pension benefits and make decisions about burial rights. So it was a real challenging, tough decision time. And we argued about it and fought about it and fretted about it, because think about it. What's the right decision? There really is no right. You just do the best you can to figure out. But you're going to be cheating someone, whichever decision you make. We decided to go for marriage, full marriage equality. And I think it was the right decision, but I was always personally tormented by the fact that we were denying the people who needed those benefits immediately, who had to wait year after year after year until we won the marriage rights, which is about 6 years later. So if they got sick or needed pension benefits or needed burial decisions or needed medical decisions, they were out of luck for those 6 years. And I tell you that story just to say that those kinds of incidents and those kinds of decisions are marbled throughout our legislative history. A lot of things that at a 30,000-foot distance, you might say, well, it was easy to make the decision. Of course, you're going for marriage equality. But this stuff isn't as easy as it thinks when you're talking about real people and real world situations and problems that exist in their day-to-day lives. Eventually, we moved on to marriage equality, of course, and the fight. And Massachusetts ended up being the first state in the nation to defeat DOMA, the Defense of Marriage Act, which we called the Denial of Marriage Act. You never let your enemies name the battle. We became the first state in the nation to do that. I don't want to bogart too much time. I'd love to talk about what we did on trans rights, but I think maybe I will pause now, let everybody else speak, and then go through that part of the history. Thank you.
All right, so I'm Tanya Neslusan. I am the executive director of Mass Equality, and I just want to say, I think Arline summed it all up, so I'm going to go home now. But no, what I want to touch on is some of the stuff that Arline didn't touch on, which is the court decisions and the significance of the court decisions. Back in, even now, most civil rights gains, whether they are for the LGBTQ movement or racial justice movements or disability justice movements, are actually won initially through Supreme Court decisions, either at the state or the federal level. And that's really important because when we look back, it's easy to say and paint with a broad brush, well, this legislature wasn't on our side during the marriage equality days, and how could they be pro-LGBTQ now? Well, the answer is very few people were. And even those who were on our side were not vocally, publicly supportive in many cases. So a lot of times you do need to go to that level of getting it done through a court decision first. That's not to say, as we saw with the repeal of Roe v. Wade last year, that we don't need to make sure that we enshrine things in legislative action after the fact. And that becomes very important because when we're talking about the Roe v. Wade reversal, what that did was that impacted privacy rights, which is the foundation for a lot of other Supreme Court decisions that have ensured safety and protection, which is why after that, we actually went back to try and repeal some of the old sodomy laws that are still on the books in Massachusetts, because we never thought we needed to, because we had that court decision. And generally speaking, when you have court precedent, the thought is, well, that's not going to change. What we've been seeing with the recent court is sometimes that does change. And sometimes those court decisions don't work in our favor either. With regard to the civil unions versus marriage, aside from the list of benefits enshrined with either, it's also going back to Supreme Court decisions and the doctrine that separate but equal is not equal. And that was one of the things that was predicated when the Goodrich decision was entered, and with subsequent decisions on marriage. When we look at the history of our community's struggles, I look back oftentimes to when I was in college in the early 90s and telling the first trusted adult in my life that I thought I might be gay. And the first thing that they said to me was, if you do this thing, you can get fired from your job, so don't plan on having a career. You can get turned away for housing, so your housing isn't going to be stable. You can't get married. You can't have children. I raised my child as a single mother, and the earliest part of his life, I was very concerned that when things got heated in custody battle, that I would have my son taken away for me for violations of moral turpitude. And that wasn't that long ago. And I think we really have to think about the fact that that which we esteem too lightly can be taken away from us just as easily. And I think that's part of what we're seeing now. And we also have to look at who we left out of the fight, and how we framed the fight. I think one of the things that I always looked at, the marketing campaign that I like to jokingly refer to marriage equality as, and no offense to anyone in the room, especially any of you who fought for it, is gays. They're just like us. And we're not. And that's a dirty little secret that we don't like to tell anybody. We socialize differently. Our communities operate a little bit differently, but we didn't want to message that because it made us less marketable as, no, we're just looking to picket fence in the suburbs and because of that, because we wanted to market ourselves as the all-American family on the cover of JCPenney catalog, we pushed aside people who were gender nonconforming. We pushed aside people who were not white, who did not speak English as a native language. And I think the other piece of marriage equality that was very important, and some of the people that we lost in that fight were people that we lost because of the immigration issues, where, we need to make sure that, and this was part of the federal marriage battle, is making sure that people who immigrated, got married, would not have to risk losing their spouse to deportation, and would have the same path to citizenship that anyone else who married an American citizen would. So there are all these ripple effects, and there are all these folks that we left behind. And now we're kind of starting to circle back and, tap on the shoulder. Oh yeah, by the way, we forgot trans people need healthcare. We forgot our kids need sex ed. And we're doing all of these we forgots. And we are now, I think because of that, we're also, I think, getting a lot of backlash, in part because people are starting to find out our little secrets, that we are not just like, every cisgender heterosexual couple in the world. And our relationships don't always look like every cisgender heterosexual couple in the world. And because of that, and because instead of hiding in our little secret corners of gay bars, back when I first started going to gay bars in the late 80s, so a long time ago, you didn't have windows. You went in through back alleys. There were no signs out front. There were no rainbow flags out front because you didn't want to draw attention to yourself. You snuck in, you snuck out, You tried to make sure that your friends didn't know which bus you were getting off of, so they didn't see you going in there, or your coworkers. I remember things like back before we started, back in the day, going to Provincetown and knowing that it was the one place where I didn't have to worry about bumping into coworkers before I was out, or bumping into a family member before I was out, because we kept each other's secrets and we had a space that was all to ourselves. And once we started coming out into the open, folks started pushing back. And once we started talking more openly, folks started pushing back. And I think that's part of the reason that we are in this tremendous backlash now, is that they are not just seeing one color of our rainbow community, they're seeing the entire rainbow. And I think it's been a bit of a revelation and a shock. And with that, I'll pass it to Trey.
Yes.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Carmel Valentine. My pronouns are he and they, and I'm the executive director of the Massachusetts Transgender Political Coalition. I want to comment on something that Tanya said, which was that, we forgot trans people need healthcare. We forgot trans people also need to be included. And I would say that that was strategic. I don't think they were forgotten. We were forgotten. We were strategically not included. Right. And I think back to ENDA, the Employment Non-Discrimination Act, where we are trying to pass that, right? There's in Massachusetts. I don't know, I'm not really a historian or a politician, so I may not get all of the dates correct. But that fight was about non-discrimination for LGBTQ folks in employment, right? However, when we put transgender folks included in that, it was gay, lesbian, and bi folks were like, no, this is not going to pass if trans people are on there. So in order for it to pass, in order for there to be advancement in the LGBTQ community, trans people had to be forgotten strategically, right? So I just wanted to say that.
And for clarity, we forgot the bees too.
That's true. It's true. The bis were also forgotten. Absolutely. It was really just the gay and lesbian movement. If folks don't know this, that MTPC, the Massachusetts Transgender Political Coalition, is the oldest active transgender advocacy organization in the United States. And we've been active for nearly 22 years now, so since 2001. And we successfully advocated for legal protections and rights at statewide level and in various municipalities in Massachusetts. Now, we started with actually having small ordinances in cities and towns, and that started in 1997. I believe Cambridge was the first to have an ordinance, then Northampton, and then Boston, I believe. But we have successfully campaigned for non-discrimination ordinances in Boston, Cambridge, Northampton, Amherst, Salem, Brookline, Somerville, Worcester, Newton, Medford, and Swampscott. Swamp. Right. Now, even though MTPC is the oldest active trans organization, there have been many states that have passed trans rights before us. So MTPC is actually the blueprint for other states. We filed the first piece of legislation in 2006. And it was not until 2011 that we successfully passed the Transgender Equal Rights bill. So that took, 2006 to 2011. That's 5 years, right? And we had to pass that bill. Well, when that bill was passed, basically we got non-discrimination protections on the basis of gender identity and expression in employment, in housing, in credit and lending, and in education. What was left out was public accommodations. that was another strategic move, because we were basically having public accommodations, saying basically you cannot discriminate against a transgender person in a public place, and the state wasn't ready for that. And so we passed the Trans Equal Rights Bill without public accommodation. So it still meant that trans people could be discriminated against in hospitals, in airports, in locker rooms, restaurants, on the T, in the park, pretty much anywhere, right? And so in 2013, we began the work to then file for public accommodations. And so we put forth that piece of legislation, and we put forth that piece of legislation, and I believe it was in
2016.
It's 2016, yes. So actually, in 2016, it was passed. However, there was enough opposition to put it back on the ballot for the November ballot in 2018. And we knew that if this was repealed, then all of the rest of the laws that we had on the books for transgender people would be had the risk of being repealed. So this then became the Yes on 3 campaign. And we had trans people, we had our allies, we had parents, we had youth. Oh my gosh, the amount of turnout from youth and young people to share their story, which but just to note, it is on one hand, there is the space to share your story, right? And everybody deserves that space. Everybody deserves for their story to be heard, and for them to share their story. And on the other hand, there is the trauma of sharing a story, because a lot of the stories that were being shared were really painful, and then young people having to relive that. And it is our pain that moves things forward, unfortunately. And so there were, everybody, so we had phone banks, we had our parents, we had businesses, we've got churches, as many people as possible to really show up and really secure that in Massachusetts, transgender people are treated with dignity and respect. And so in 2018, Massachusetts became the 18th state to fully protect transgender people under the law. And that took up pretty much most of the organization's existence. And so now our work is now, how do we implement some of these laws, right? And we are still trying to figure that out, because Massachusetts, while we have these protections, is not necessarily a safe place for people. And we have people who are coming in from other states that are more unsafe, right? And so Massachusetts, I think, really presents itself as a refuge. And I think a lot of work really needs to go into that for that to actually be true.
Please.
I thought it might be helpful to comment on many of the important points that Tanya and Treyandre just made. And part of it segues to the part that I didn't share, but it sort of fills in some of the holes, which is that after the marriage fight, as Treyandre pointed out, the next step was fighting for the trans community to have a bill that was analogous to what we had fought for the Gay and Lesbian Civil Rights Bill. The Gay and Lesbian Civil Rights Bill was about sexual orientation. Those were the two words we were trying to add to the law, the word sexual orientation. And then it was time to add gender identity and expression to the law. When we were fighting that for the early on in the around 2010. I remember the then head of the Mass Transgender Political Coalition, a guy named Gunnar Scott, saying to me, "Oh, Arline, it's taking so long for this to pass. I can't believe it. I don't know if I'll be able to stand it." And I said, "Gunnar, it took us 17 freaking years to pass the Gay and Lesbian Civil Rights Bill, adding sexual orientation. I promise you it'll take less time to add gender identity and expression." And it did. In 2011, that bill passed, but it was another decision point that I think is worth noting for history, if you will, which is that the legislature told us, matter of fact, it was some of the same conservatives who were involved in the marriage negotiation who wanted us to not get marriage rights, but 25% of the marriage rights. Some of those same characters were involved in negotiations around this, and they said they were not going to add public accommodations to the bill. They would never agree to that at that moment in time. Just take housing, credit, and employment, anti-discrimination, and be happy. And then we had big arguments and heated discussions and tough decisions to make about what do we do. Personally, I said, don't take the deal. I thought we should fight for the whole, Megillah. But I wasn't trans. I'm not trans, so I had no right to make the final decision. It had to be made by MTPC. They came in and said, we want to take the deal. And in hindsight, I think they were right. And I think they were right because once the law passed that you couldn't discriminate in employment against trans folks, that, and in schools, that began the beginning of the end. It changed the world because suddenly all these anti-trans folks had to work side by side with people that they were terrified of. And they saw, they're not so bad. Suddenly people in the work world had to share bathrooms. The thing that had been used as a weapon against us in those fights was that, you don't want trans people in the bathrooms, right? Suddenly they had to share bathrooms with trans people, and they realized that the world as they knew it was not torn asunder as a result. And so so that's why I think the public accommodations bill moved so quickly and passed just a few years later, because unbeknownst to our opponents, they were helping us change the world incrementally by emotionally getting people comfortable with the notion of having public accommodations added into the law. But it was a tough decision. And it's, again, one of those things that sort of gets lost into history. How Hamilton, you want to be in the room where it happens. Sometimes you don't want to be in the room. You want someone else to make the decision. Additionally, you guys were right that it really was a strategic decision early on. Now, interestingly, it didn't happen with the Gay and Lesbian Civil Rights Bill in the 80s because it never came up. The issue of adding gender identity did not come up. It wasn't in the lexicon of people's thinking at that point. And we had trans activists working on the Gay and Lesbian Civil Rights Bill, fundraising for it. Nancy Nandrioni had a gender talk radio show that we used to be on to talk about the bill, and no one ever raised it because people weren't thinking about it just then. But it became obvious later on that it needed to be done. But it was a strategic. Had it come up, it would have been a strategic decision. You're absolutely right about that. When it did come up, it was at the federal level, when there was a big issue about whether an anti-discrimination bill would be moved in Congress. There was a heated debate in our community, very intentional heated debate about should gender identity and expression be included. And at that point, I guess that was the 90s, I don't remember. People were saying, yeah, you got to include it. Was it the aughts? Okay. I remember we had to insist with people like Barney Frank to convince him that it needed to be included because he was concerned, and strategically he may have been right at that point, but he was concerned that that would kill the bill. So what you add into a piece of legislation is always a strategic decision, and sometimes a very painful one, because there's almost always.
Well, I think it's almost always a painful one, because what you are saying, anytime that you trim something out of a bill, and it happens all the time. This isn't a historical thing. It happens all the time. What we are saying every time we say it's okay to trim something out of the bill is that your identity doesn't matter so much, and you can get in the back of the line and you'll get your rights when it's your turn. And ultimately, as a human being, it's an awful thing to say, and it's an awful way of looking at it. And when you think about, I think LGBTQ, rights in general, there is a very definite order in which we get our rights. And there is a there is a reason why we are still fighting for the parentage laws in this state to be updated. And part of that reason is simply misogyny, because it's considered a women's issue. And it's not simply a women's issue, but at the same time, women's issues get pushed to the back. Trans issues get pushed to the back. Issues for the BIPOC communities get pushed to the back. And this is always a struggle, because when you trim a piece off of this bill and a piece off of this bill and a piece off of this bill, and you're always trimming from the same communities, you will, at least I've never seen, and maybe you have, and you have some historical context there, but I have never seen a situation in which we've said, you know what, we're going to make sure that this LGBTQ issue, we're going to make sure that, the people who are centered in this bill are trans people of color, and we're going to trim off the bits that impact white cisgender gays.
Oh, I would love that. Where's that bill?
But when you have an omnibus bill like that, there are definite, orders in which issues get addressed and issues get prioritized.
And there was always the issue of messaging. The messenger is the message sometimes. And so we triaged all sorts of people. I actually had a very awkward, I can't believe I'm about to admit this, I may come to regret it, but it was a strategy session one night on the marriage fight. And somebody said, well, we have to get more, someone to be helpful proffered that we needed to get more synagogues involved. And I had to say, no, we don't. We don't need any more Jews. I'm Jewish, so I could say it. We don't need any more Jews. Jews aren't going to get us any votes in the legislature. Half of them hate Jews. So we need Irish Catholics. That's who we need to help us win over more legislative votes. It was painful to say it, but it was strategically absolutely true. And that night I got a call from an activist who said, "You're an anti-Semite." And I said, well, let me tell you what I really am. But you do make those strategic decisions. And when you deal with a legislature that's racist and sexist and anti-Semitic and all sorts of things, and it was really bad back then, particularly in the days when the Senate president was Bill Bulger, that's Whitey Bulger's brother. But at least he and people from those days were equal opportunity haters. They hated everyone who wasn't from South Boston, so we didn't take it personally. They hated Jews and women and gays and blacks. But yes, you have to make all sorts of really strategic, painful decisions sometimes, because the messenger can be the message. And we're dealing with a bigoted legislature, or at least we were back then.
But I do think too, and the other thing is, that's why I think representation matters so much. And the other piece that I do want to touch upon too, that is overlooked because they aren't quite so cute, is the aging population. We like to center youth issues, and the youth always have issues. But, quite frankly, because every new generation, and, it was the same thing when I was young, and, every new generation is seeing the world for the first time, and they see their issues, and they are marketable because they are adorable. But, what's often not so adorable? the cranky old, queer who's like, okay, I need a bath and nobody's going to help me, or I need disability accommodations and I'm experiencing, discrimination in my hospital setting, or, my assisted living facility. And those are the issues that, we keep putting them off because, they're not so cute and easy to prop up on a stage. But we keep putting them off until we're sitting there in the assisted living home being discriminated against or not having proper medical care. And we're like, oh, wait, yeah, we forgot about us. And then next generation, we forgot about us again.
The one time when we actually did play the elder card very intentionally, it was in the marriage fight. Everyone assumed that the best way to market marriage was to say, we want to have kids and, when we need equal rights. But the people who focused on that forgot that for a lot of straight legislators, the idea of us having kids was like, ooh, ick, no, that's the last thing I want, right? So we went to the other end of the spectrum. We said, let's go to the elders in our community, the people who've been in relationships for 30 and 40 years, and let's show why they need these benefits, right? The ability to get married. And part of the messenger is the message. One of the reasons we did it is because what do elder people mean to political folks? They mean three things. Number one, they vote. Young people in the lines of electeds, they don't vote. Older people always vote. Number two, what's the stereotype of people who are older? They don't have sex. So it allowed legislators to not think of that one thing that gave them the creeps about us, right? They didn't have to think about the S word. And when you had older people, everyone knows at some point you're going to be old if you make it. You may or may not change your sexuality. You may or may not change your gender identity. You may or may not change all sorts of things about yourself, but you're going to get old. And so legislators could relate to that. And so we started bringing in the Aging Project and all these people who started saying, and legislators ate it up because because the messenger is the message.
I would just add one thing, just like currently, and actually it's been like this for quite some time, that the resources in Massachusetts for transgender people are for those who are 25 and under. Once you hit 25, you're shit out of luck. Interesting. Absolutely, right? There are no resources for trans people past 25 in Massachusetts.
That's a good point. Yeah, it's a very good point.
Yeah. And the other thing too, I want to add, one of the great things about the aging population that I found, and I remember when my wife and I were getting married, she had never come out to her grandmother, and who helped to raise her. She lived with her grandmother growing up. And when she told her grandmother, and we sat down with her, she just said, well, that's great. I'm too old to give a shit about that anymore. I'm just glad to have it. And that was a lesson that I took with me when I was knocking doors in 2018, advocating for trans public accommodations. I actually used to go to senior centers and I took that lesson with me today when now I'm advocating for LGBTQ youth, where I go to the seniors and I just, because you might have, somebody who's my age who does not know what to do with their transgender 12-year-old. But you know what? Their grandma does not care. Their grandma doesn't care about you anymore because their focus has shifted to the grandchild. And sometimes they are the best advocates because they don't care what you do so much as who you are. And I have found them to be some of our greatest advocates for young people.
So Joan passed on a whole list of questions, and you guys have actually covered almost all.
Sorry, I went rogue a little bit.
That's fantastic. So I think that maybe we can do one question from Joan's list, maybe two, and then we can open it up and see if there's some questions from the audience. So Joan wrote, when we think about LGBTQ political history in Massachusetts, we have a number of queer and trans candidates and elected officials. Has that representation moved us forward? Have these politicians advocated for queer rights? I'm thinking of Barney Frank, Gary Studds, Althea Garrison, Elaine Noble, David Skandaris.
Barney, yes. Studds, yes. Althea, absolutely not. Zero, probably counterproductive. Yeah, negative. She was a Black trans woman, or maybe is she still alive? She is. Okay.
He doesn't identify that way, though.
Okay, and that was part of, and she was elected as a Republican. Go figure.
And an independent and a Democrat.
and so all these Republican legislators had this colleague who embodied everything that they were terrified of and feared and loathed.
Mm-hmm.
And they just ignored it. It was like, the love that dare not speak its name. This was like the person who we dare not even talk about, and who was sitting next to them for all of one term. But the rest of them makes a huge difference. Representation matters a lot. We've got some dynamos in the LGBTQ caucus, legislative caucus in our right now, and it's making all the difference in the world to our ability to move legislation.
It does make a huge difference, but I do think that one of the things that I have seen recently is in some conservative circles, they have been weaponizing gay legislators against the trans community. And I saw it specifically last year when we had a gay man who was running for Congress who made it all about trying to instill fear about the transgender community. And that's one of the things that concerns me, because just because somebody is gay or just because somebody is trans does not mean that they are an effective advocate for our community. Absolutely. Or a willing advocate for our community. Right. And it does not mean, and oftentimes some of the problematic folks, because they are a member of our community, get a bigger platform in, more conservative, closed circles, because they can say, well, the one gay guy I know who is this, politician right here who is campaigning, he told me that I need to be afraid of these people, or that, and they will stir it up for their own political game. And, that said, the members of our LGBTQ caucus at the State House are phenomenal. They do fight for us. They do listen to us. I really appreciate it, because one of the things that I noticed when working with the legislature, and this isn't against anyone or anything, but oftentimes our needs get overlooked by people who aren't members of the community. And just simply because it's not something that's at the top of their head. So when I'm looking at a bill, I remember I was reviewing a bill at one point, and it was on abortion, and it was talking about women. I think, well, it's not women, it's people, because, not everyone who has a baby or can get pregnant identifies as a woman. And we need to remember this. And this is what we're here for, is to nag legislators who don't know. But generally speaking, the members who are, from our community have a better sense of it. That said, we definitely need more LGBTQ legislators, and particularly we need more trans LGBTQ legislators, and we need more BIPOC LGBTQ legislators, because there are very specific issues for those communities that, again, just like anything else, if it's not your own experience, it's not always top of mind.
I'll give you an example, if I may, about one bill that passed last year that didn't get nearly as much attention as I think it ought to have. It was a bill that it was framed as the provider protection. It was in response to the Dobbs decision repealing the Roe versus the Roe case, our right to abortion. It was to protect providers and to protect people who come from other states, the hostile states like Texas, where they have bounty hunters that can go after someone for having an abortion. And we know that people from states like Texas are going to come to Massachusetts, where it's safe and legal to have an abortion, if they perhaps went to school here or have friends or family here, for any number of reasons, if they can afford to come here. And so when we were worried about the bounty hunters from Texas, states like that, coming here, going after somebody who'd got an abortion here and before they go back, when they go back to Texas. So a fabulous bill was crafted by the repro rights groups, led by the ACLU, did much of the drafting and much of the lobbying, and a great bill was passed. And in it, because of gay legislators like Julian Sear and Joe Comerford in the Senate, for example, we were able to insert into that bill that it provided protections not simply for people having abortions in Massachusetts, but for gender affirming care. And not only were we able to get that in, but the Senate President, Karen Spilka, who was fabulously supportive of our community, didn't bat an eye. She didn't raise a question. She didn't care. It was like, well, yeah, good idea, of course. And then when it got to the House and the Speaker of the House, Ron Mariano, looked at it, it was like, and Aaron Mickelwitz, the Ways and Means Chair, and they were all absolutely no problem whatsoever. Baker had some issues. Someone had to call him, a senator had to call him up and explain to him why it was important to keep gender affirming care in there. But this bill is now called, you called it refuge. Yeah. Some people call it the SHIELD Act, but let me tell you, it's a big effing deal. Mm-hmm. It really is. And Massachusetts was the first state to pass a good version of the bill. I think another state tried it and they kind of screwed up the wording and got into problems with things like the Constitution. But Massachusetts got it right, and has now become a template for other states to replicate it as they have. But it's a function of just what you were saying, having LGBTQ legislators there who are willing to fight.
Do we have questions from the audience or questions online? We have some questions. Okay.
What do you think of the people who use the Bible as a weapon against you, or really against anybody, but they do it?
Who use
the Bible, use the Bible.
Oh yeah.
And they always say, well, it's not in the Bible, it's this, that, and this, but we can never find that page.
Oh no, there actually is affirming. There are affirming passages in the Bible about transgender people. Yeah. Yes, there are also affirming passages about gay people in the Bible, and specifically men who love men. I have actually personally read the Bible 7 times, and there is not a word about lady loving in there. I've looked. Yeah. So with right, but the other piece too is that you need to look at the historical context of the Bible, and that's what I'll often talk to, because I actually do go to churches and synagogues and speak with faith leaders and congregate and religious people about what the Bible actually says, and about what Scripture actually says, and a lot of it you need to look at the historical context. So, for instance, that passage in Leviticus that they're always talking about, with spilling seed. That actually came during a time when there was a population crisis. So it wasn't actually admonishing people against having relations with men or masturbating because it's sinful. It was because, no, save it up because we need more babies. So that's kind of what I tend to talk about. And I'm sorry, but I'm like a real religious nerd. So
I would add that the Bible and a lot of sort of like religious texts have been used as weapons, not only in sort of like controlling people in terms of our gender, but also people of color, right? Mm-hmm. So it's not only about like what about the Bible itself, but also like it's not about the power, but how we wield it, right? And so there is don't know if you've heard of this, but I haven't read this yet, but there's something called queering the Bible.
Yes.
That actually brings out and highlights all the queerness that is sort of like throughout the Bible. So I recommend that book. Actually, I might just buy it and read it.
I have it. I can lend it to you. Yeah.
Hey.
I'm going to get
Yeah. And the other thing too, that I like to bring it back to, and also I just to pull it out of the Judeo-Christian frame too, a little bit. The other piece that I do want to emphasize is when we are talking about things, we often frame it through a Western, Judeo-Christian frame. Yeah. And that's not the entire world. Half of my family comes from India, which, traditionally never had 2 genders. We had more. The same thing with, Native Americans, South Americans, Africans, like culture,
Jewish.
Yeah.
Communities.
Cultures all over the world are different. And I remember we had a panel at one point, an interfaith panel, and I was speaking with a Muslim scholar. And I asked him, about where, Islam fell. And he said, well, you have to remember that before colonialism, kind of dominated our space and our interpretation of our texts. If you have seen ancient Persian poetry and art, you would know that there is nothing in the Quran that specifically forbids homosexuality. Mm-hmm. So, and judge not lest ye be judged is
one of the things also in the marriage fight, we intentionally played the religion card, to be quite crass, which was that historically religion was used as a battering ram against our people. It was either you were with the gays or you were with God. We turned it on its head very intentionally. The RCFM, Religious Coalition for the Freedom to Marry. Fabulous people who organize the religious community, clergy of all denominations to support us. Why did that make a difference? Because then instead of it being gays versus God, it became God versus God. It's like my version of God versus your version of God. My version of God says marriage equality is okay. Yours says it's not. Making a legislator choose between religions is like the last thing in the world they'd ever want. So it put them in a vice grip where they couldn't say, I'm doing it because of my priest called me, because they also had ministers in their district who said something else. And then the dynamic really, it blew a lid on the entire conversation.
I just want to, sorry, really quickly. There's this church in New York called Middle Church, and I follow them on Instagram, and they posted something for Pride that says, people will say God isn't queer. Then talk about a love transcending time and space, who is both human and divine and simultaneously 3 and 1. That's pretty queer, honey.
Thank you so much for the historical context and also sort of the current context, because here we are again. And I'm particularly interested in some of the connections that you're making with people outside of the state. I've been working in Florida for the last month or so on lots of issues. I mean, banned books and LGBT and DEI, and but it seems like a moment to be collaborating and connecting. And I'm just curious, sort of, what kinds of places that you are able to connect, either politically or faith communities, or, because everybody needs support right now.
Yeah, so I mean, Mass Equality is a Massachusetts-based organization, but we do partner with other organizations. MTPC and Mass Equality are part of the Equality Federation, which partners with statewide organizations all across the country. We also, on occasion work with our federal legislators and federal advocacy groups as well. And then, we also have people who show up. I've actually literally had people show up on my doorstep who have come from out of state looking for places. And, while I can't, just have them come home with me, because we already have that problem with pets. And if I started bringing home humans, my wife would really, really have an issue. So, but we can connect them with resources, and we can try and help them to find, direct service agencies within Massachusetts. We do try and deter people from, we had one young woman who had $50 to her name, and she was like, it's enough for a bus ticket to Boston. And we were like, yeah, but $50 is not enough once you get to Boston, and we don't want you in a worse place here.
Anyway, but it's just an interesting thing, and I just wanted to agree with the religion part. And my family is very religious, but not Bible thumpers. And tolerance is very important. And I thought for a long time it was just, when I transitioned, my mom was in her 90s now, so it was being just tolerant. And I realized when I talked to lots of other people that tolerant was almost supportive and was really a good thing. So I felt a lot better about my own situation after that.
I want to thank our panelists for a really wonderful presentation. I want to thank all of you for joining us, both online and in person. And I'm sure that they would answer a few more questions when the program ends. So thank you very much.